And here we go.
Welcome to the Great Work Insights Podcast by the O.C. Tanner Institute, the show that features the people, the professionals, the thought leaders, and the coolest companies. And now your host, the man navigating the discussion about the culture, the organized chaos, and the best practices that compel great work, Todd Nordstrom.
The goal in any career is progress, to move up, right? Think about that concept for a second. As humans, we enter this world, we become socialized, then we become educated, and then we enter the workforce with the expectation that we'll continue to grow and learn and keep rising up the ranks. Of course, there's an irony in that scenario when it comes to work. Continuous progress also means that at certain points, we'll need to face situations and perform in areas where we actually have absolutely no experience. We're blind in these new situations. And sometimes, even though we might have the perfect background and resume to take on a certain new role or a new situation, we still fail. The big question, of course, is why? Those of us who have been in the workforce long enough have either experienced this ourselves or we've seen coworkers or employees flop, fail, as they were promoted to new positions, especially as managers. And our guest today has insight into why this might be happening, especially with those new managers and new leaders. Please welcome to the show Patrick Bosworth, CEO and founder of Leadership Choice, a leadership training and coaching company that has worked with some of the largest companies in the country. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me on today.
I've been familiar with your company for a long time now, and we've actually known each other for quite some time. I know you coach professionals in numerous areas of performance and communication, but we had a conversation at a conference a while back where you were a presenter, and you mentioned something called the management death zone. I found it fascinating, and I'd love for you to tell the audience about it.
Great. Yeah, that sounds. I'm happy to do so. Let's take a step back first, though, and I want to kind of give a little intro of how we came on to what is the management death zone. Mm-hmm. In the aviation world, there is something they call the killing zone. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty sensitive topic, so I don't make light of it, but the reality is 57% of all aviation fatalities occur in a certain zone. This zone is between 100 and 350 hours. So pilots are measured by how many hours they've flown. Mm-hmm. So 100 to 350 hours, 57% of fatalities occur. So this is really where the mistakes are being made that are quite costly. The interesting part about this is for a pilot to receive their license, they typically receive it on average between 50 and 60 hours. Mm-hmm. So pilots, when they get their license, aren't actually in the killing zone. So student pilots, even though we think that might be the most risky time, turns out less than 5% of fatalities occur with actual student pilots. So you have this area where people get in trouble, and yet it's not when they're first learning, it's shortly thereafter. It's, I've received my license, I am now flying on my own, and this is what's called the killing zone between 100 and 350 hours.
That's interesting. So it's almost like a fake confidence when after you get past that early stage, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, you go from having a co-pilot, right? When you're a student pilot, you fly, you have some solo hours, but most of the time spent, at least initially, is with a co-pilot. You also, this is a time when student pilots are actually expected to, I guess it's like, I don't know if expected is the word, but they're encouraged to seek help. It's a climate in which there's a lot of help available, and you have this co-pilot with you. Student pilots tend to be a little more calculated in the risks they take, mm-hmm. and certainly they're not overconfident. I actually got my pilot's license many years ago, and honestly, initially you're scared to death,
sure.
And so you're extra cautious, and you're always asking help, and so you can begin to see why as soon as that structure is taken away, you begin to enter in what's called the killing zone.
It's fascinating though, because if you think about it, then all of a sudden there's the fatality rate drops, after you get through that zone, and you're saying that there's a killing zone or a management death zone in the working world too, correct?
That's correct. If you think about it, how does someone become a manager, right? Mm-hmm. Often they were the best individual contributor, mm-hmm. and they were used to getting work done on their own. And so because they were the best at what they did, they got promoted into a management role. And sometimes it's really what we would call a battlefield promotion as well, where somebody left the company, and so automatically you just get pushed into the role as a manager. Mm-hmm. And so when you're in that management role, you are now in what we call the management death zone. And the definition we've given for that is we call it the high-risk period when an individual is promoted into a supervisory or a management position. And they're often very vulnerable, sometimes ineffective, sometimes they flounder, and sometimes they even become a possible risk to the organization. Mm-hmm. In my mind, what you have here is someone who is very talented, very capable, is the best contributor, and is now doing the best they can in a role that they don't understand fully, where they're now expected to get work done through others as opposed to being the contributor that they were, the day before. Mm-hmm. So that's what we call the management death zone. And if you think about your own career, or as people listen to this, you begin to think about how we became managers or how we became leaders. And in most cases, it wasn't, after years of training necessarily on how to become a manager or lead people. Sure. It really was because we were great contributors and usually technically competent in our fields.
Yeah. But so just like the killing zone, is there in the management death zone, is there a point that if you make it through that window, then all of a sudden your success rate, gets better, or your failure rate drops? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it can. The reality is what we don't like to see happen, and it happens too often, is unlike the killing zone where it's a little bit more finite, mm-hmm. In the management death zone, often people stay in that zone for a long period of time.
Or forever, right?
Well, they can. I mean, they're doing the best they can, and they're usually likable people, mm-hmm. but the effectiveness rate is pretty low, and you begin to see the symptoms of it. You'll see where productivity may not be as high in certain areas. Sometimes they're great one-way communicators, and so their listening skills aren't great. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they micromanage. Sometimes they're a little too heavy-handed. And the worst part is they often tolerate poor performance because they're not entirely sure what to do about that.
Sure.
And so what you don't want to do is keep them in that zone for a long time. And so you're really trying to get them through that zone as quickly as possible. Again, the zone is relatively inevitable. They're going to have to go through it. Mm-hmm. The trick is to say, how do we avoid spending hundreds of hours and, frankly, years in that area if we can get them, the goal is to get them through that much quicker.
So, Patrick, a large portion of the audience of this show, they're HR leaders, they're leaders within organizations, they're the C-suite. What can organizations, what can they do to help new managers, new leaders make it through this period?
Yeah. Well, the good news about the audience is what we're talking about isn't foreign. They're certainly, in fact, many of them are probably cringing as they're listening to this, going, and names come into their heads of who they're currently working with that fit that right now. What's interesting is if we go back to the piloting world for just a minute, mm-hmm. In the piloting world, it's governed by the National Transportation Safety Board. Mm-hmm. And so this whole killing zone was quite alarming to them. And so they began to look at what is the answer? How do we get people through this zone faster since it's not really avoidable? They came out with some answers. One of them was we have to make their first 100 hours of flying more effective. It has to count. Mm-hmm. They had to be smarter in how they went about training pilots. And what they're really wanting to do is eliminate the killing zone by training out, if you will, the next accident. So helping people understand scenarios, situations that they would face before they actually entered into that. Mm-hmm. Well, if you go back to the HR listener and really the world we play in, the answers are very similar. The answers are we have to be more effective in how we prepare and help them be effective in this management role. And so training becomes our go-to answer. The challenge there is that most training is really ineffective. Most training is often, in my words, I say it's a waste of time and money. Because if you look at the statistics on it, only about 10 to 30% of what is ever taught in a training environment actually shows up in real behavior. Wow. And again, your listener's going to go, yep, that's pretty consistent with my experience as well. We all get it. We know that training isn't happening the way we want it to. So that's really the trick, is to say, how do we design and build out more effective training programs? So we spend a lot of our time helping people put together much more effective, much more modern, much more flexible, and ultimately much better supported programs so that these managers and leaders get through this zone quickly without running into all of the traps. In fact, what we're really saying is, how do we get them ready faster so that they're effective in their roles? If you go back again to how we put them into the role, it's most cases they weren't trained, if you will, before they became the manager. Most of the time we're playing catch-up, saying, sure, congratulations, you're the boss. Now you get to do performance reviews. You may get a different parking spot, and good luck.
Yeah.
And again, we deal with the best desire for them to be successful, but it's just not enough to get them through the zone. That's how this floundering begins, and they're doing the best they can with what they've been given. Mm-hmm. So what we really begin to do is look at, how do we put together programs that are much more flexible in their learning? How do they have options, and how do we avoid the traditional format, which is go to class, come back to work, and apply? Mm-hmm. So what you really want to do is build in support mechanisms throughout the process. So again, we like to train and teach in chunks so that people are getting training, and that's delivered in multiple formats, from exposure with classroom to live virtual to e-learning, lots of different methodologies, using live examples, using video clips. There's a lot of neat ways you can do that today. The biggest driver on the back end, though, is that's just providing content. Mm-hmm. They still need help with application. How do I actually apply this in real life? So it's really important that on the back end, managers have a coach, that managers have mentors, people that have been there, done that can actually help them apply the knowledge that we give them and successfully use it in real life, so it just doesn't end up becoming what we call shelf art, right? When people go to training programs, come back, get busy, and put the workbook back on the shelf. There was some research done a number of years back that essentially said, 15% of people that go to training go back to work and don't even apply. They don't even try. They're just busy. They go back to work. So they kind of ignore what they've been taught. 15% successfully apply what they've learned. So for some reason, there's this group of people that just seem to get it. They have some natural abilities to apply it, or they've had some past experience that helps them use it. That leaves us with the majority of 70%, and 70% of people go to training, receive training, get help, go back to work, try to apply what they've learned, but they just don't have enough support, and so they go back to what they used to do. Mm-hmm. And so you have a large willing audience who are saying, with a little more help and encouragement, I can actually pull this off. And if you can really target that area, target that group of leaders by providing them with the back-end resources, the coaching, the mentoring, and real application-type situations that help them successfully apply what they've learned, then now what you've done is you've basically said, rather than having 15% of these managers transitioning effectively through the management death zone, you're able to get about 85% sure. who are actively willing. Now, when they start doing that, it actually puts some pressure on that 15% who didn't try. and so they start to realize they're odd person out, and they begin to put some more effort in there as well. So this is really the best way, is to go follow the same approach that they've done with pilots, which is make training much more effective, much more successful, put more resources into it, so that people actually have the back-end support as you do it. One of the tricks to doing that as well is to make sure that you've involved that participant's boss, that manager's boss, in the process. And one of the mistakes we make is to assume that the boss will take over that responsibility and automatically do it. It's a great thought, and it would make life much easier, but often they're already working 60 hours a week, and they often sometimes really were promoted without successfully learning some of these skill sets themselves when they were managers for some of the same reasons. And so what we really want to do is provide the resources to help the participant pull the boss into the process, so that the boss is actively engaged in taking an active role, but they're not expected to be the sole resource or primary resource, frankly, to ensuring that their manager is getting through the zone successfully.
Yeah, that's, it's interesting, because if you compare the management world to the aviation world, and you being a pilot probably remember that first time you went out by yourself, and you probably were terrified because you didn't have that support system there. And the good news is in the management world is that you can have that support system there. You just have to build a program around it, correct?
Correct. And frankly, I think of my first management role, and guess what? I fell right into that management death zone as much as anybody else. So if once you acknowledge it, realize that this is real.
Yeah.
And in the ironic part to all of this is nobody is that surprised by this. Organizations get it. They realize that managers are tasked with a tremendous responsibility. In fact, they seem to be the workhorses, if you will, of successful businesses. And yet, the real question is, what do we do about it? How do we build these programs that are much more effective, much more flexible, and ultimately much more supported? And that's where the coaching is just so impactful. The challenge is coaching is often reserved for senior execs and senior leaders. And so we begin to think of coaching in that level, where what we really need to do is drive it down much lower in the organization to the management level. And to do that, we just have to do it more effective and do it more cost effectively as well, so that we can actually afford to provide those kind of resources at a much lower level than we're accustomed to.
Hey,
like
Patrick,
the result, we just
let me go back to my thoughts at the beginning of this interview, because I would love your opinion on this. You work with a lot of companies across many different industries, and we all know that organizations like to recruit and hire people with experience. That makes sense, right? But
correct, yeah.
Do you see a lot of companies who might miss opportunities and great employees either by avoiding promoting people in the organization because they don't have the experience, or by promoting people because they're there, like we talked about, and then just expecting too much from them?
Well, so the answer to that is very much the case on both of those. Some organizations really pride themselves on promoting from within. It's a big value. It's part of their culture. When you come to work for them, you can expect that there is opportunity for growth and development, which is really critical today, particularly if you think of the high potential world. You don't want to lose your hypos. And so they make that part of their culture. We want to promote from within. Now, what that doesn't necessarily mean that they've taken it to the next level that says, but we've put effective programs and mechanisms in place to get people through the zone faster.
Yeah.
Then you have the other extreme where people say, well, we just don't have the talent internally, and so we go external. And now they run into some of the same risks, because you don't necessarily know what you're getting. You don't necessarily know what their background is. Maybe they've been in a management role, having for 10 years, but they've really had the same experience 10 years in a row as opposed to 10 years of experience.
Yeah.
And so this whole zone is so critical that they understand it, that they begin to put the training in place to support it, and really have some open, real gut check discussions that say, is this what we're doing in our organization? Are we floundering? Are we leveraging the talent we have? Because I've really, in all of this, when you talk to organizations, nobody says, yeah, we just take whoever has a pulse and put them in a job. That's just not how it works. Mm-hmm. We take the most talented people we have within our organization and we promote them to be leaders. And so what's often missed is that skill set and mindset shifts at that point, mm-hmm. because now you have to have a whole new set of tools in order to be effective there. And so, and people recognize it, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're good at it. And what people are really chasing is back to that 15% of people that just naturally seem to get it. Mm-hmm. That's the group organizations are trying to find all the time, which makes it very competitive. The smarter approach would be to say, how do we get that 70% who are willing but just don't have the support to be more effective? And if you can capture that, all of a sudden you're going to have a much more efficient, much more effective organization. And essentially you're going to be able to avoid this management death zone that exists.
Interesting. Good stuff. Good stuff. Patrick, so nice to have you on the show. If listeners want to learn more about you or learn more about Leadership Choice, where can they find you?
Well, we're on the web at leadershipchoice.com, so pretty straightforward.
Patrick, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Todd. Appreciate you being on.
What did you think of today's show? The conversation continues on www.octanner.com. Be sure to leave us a comment. Also, remember to rate, review, and subscribe to all our podcasts on iTunes. Now get out there and build something beautiful. It's your turn now.